I've just had the worst shock ever. My husband found out about my affair and set his car on fire. I'm using a throwaway Reddit account because I don't want this associated with my main account. I'm really stuck. I need advice on how to save my marriage. My husband set my affair partner's car on fire and then kicked me out of the house. I don't know if there's any way to save my marriage. My name is Anna, and I'm a 29-year-old woman. My husband's name is Richard, and he is a 28-year-old. I met Richard in college, and we hit it off right away. We dated for a while and then got married about a year ago. For the past year of our marriage, it was great. But there was one thing that was a bit of a problem. I was cheating on him. Richard was always busy with his tech career, tinkering with codes and algorithms, so I had a lot of free time at home. He was earning enough to cover our bills, so I ended up taking on the role of managing the household and doing the housework. Richard was always off doing his thing, and I was left to my own devices. I was left at home, feeling pretty lonely. I tried all sorts of things to keep busy, like painting, gardening, and experimenting in the kitchen, but none of it really stuck. It was like a cycle. I found something new to do, got excited about it, and then, before I knew it, I was back to feeling empty. I missed having someone to hang out with, chat with, and just have a good time. I understood why Richard was so busy, but it was tough being on my own for long stretches of time. Loneliness hits hard, you know. I just wanted someone to share life's moments with. We laughed together and felt connected. There was a constant battle against quiet, empty moments that seemed to drag on forever. So how did I meet my affair partner? Well, there was this guy, let's call him Mark. He was the type who could charm anyone, but behind that charm was a mess of drama. Mark and I had a turbulent relationship, full of cheating, drugs, and disrespect. It tore me apart, and I knew I had to break free from that toxic cycle. I broke up with him right after we graduated from high school. And then I went to college where I met Richard. He was steady and kind. He was loyal, caring, and respectful. Everything Mark wasn't. We fell in love and got married, leaving the chaos behind. Life with Richard was peaceful until Mark showed up out of nowhere. Mark resurfaced like a ghost from my past. He reached out to me and apologized. He said he didn't know I was married and that despite my hesitation, I agreed to meet him to apologize in person. I was curious to see what he had to say, and I wanted to get closure. Meeting Mark was like opening an old book filled with memories, some sweet and some bitter. We reminisced about our high school days and the drama. We laughed and caught up on old times. It was nice to connect with someone from my past, especially during those moments when Richard was buried deep in work. Even in the happiest of marriages, loneliness can creep in. Richard tried his best to be there for me, but his demanding job often took his time. He was there for me, but his job often took up a lot of his time. So when Mark suggested staying in touch, I saw it as a way to keep in contact when Richard couldn't. I had no idea how dangerous that would become. As Mark and I got back in touch, we started talking more and more, and it became I found myself checking my phone constantly, waiting for his messages. Richard noticed this new habit and asked me why I was always glued to my phone. I made up a story about getting into context creation, which seemed to satisfy him. The truth was I was enjoying the attention and conversation with Mark, especially during the times when Richard was busy with work. It felt like a breath of fresh air amidst the boredom of my daily life. The more I chatted with Mark, the more I found myself pulling away from Richard. It wasn't something I planned, it just kind of happened as happened. Our conversations got more in depth. Mark seemed to understand me in ways Richard didn't, or maybe I just never opened up to Richard like I did with Mark. We talked about everything under the sun, creating a bond that felt familiar yet thrillingly new. I knew I was drifting away from my marriage. Mark's understanding and attention filled a void I didn't even realize existed. It wasn't just about the excitement of a secret connection. It was about feeling truly heard and valued in a way that was different from my relationship with Richard. I confided more in Mark, and without realizing it, I distanced myself emotionally. From Richard, it was like building a separate world where I could be someone else, away from the routines and expectations of marriage. Mark hadn't really changed much since high school. He was still into drugs, and you couldn't always rely on him. But he had this charm that drew you in and made you forget about his flaws. He seemed more grown up now, but you could still see glimpses of his old self back then. I wasn't the most outgoing person. Mark's popularity helped me make friends, but they were more like acquaintances. People liked being around us because of him. After reconnecting with Mark post, I found a lot of comfort in our conversations. It felt good to have someone to chat with who seemed to understand me. I didn't think too much about his faults. I just enjoyed the connection we had. Looking back, I realized that I was looking for something outside my marriage, seeking comfort and attention. Mark became an escape from the routine and a way to feel special again. It wasn't about him being better than Richard. It was about feeling understood and valued, even if only for a while. I spent more time with Mark. We didn't just text or call anymore. We met up in person. We went to coffee shops, saw movies, or just walked around town. It felt good to share these simple joys with Mark. His outgoing vibe rubbed off on me. It boosted my confidence. It made me more willing to try new things. I found myself stepping out of my comfort zone. I explored new places. I enjoyed being with someone who got me. Our chats weren't just about small talk. We talked about movies, books, life experiences, and more. We talked about all sorts of things, from movies to books to life experiences. It was really refreshing to have these deep conversations and feel mentally stimulated again. It was like I'd rediscovered a part of myself that had been dormant for a while. These meetings with Mark brought excitement and freshness into my routine. I'd been craving that for a while. It was easy to get caught up in the fun and forget about the possible consequences. I was just relishing in the companionship and shared interests. Despite the warning signs, I kept up our hangouts, enjoying each other's company. I was too caught up in the moment to pay much attention. One big flag was that I always ended up footing the bill whenever we went out. Mark had a knack for conveniently forgetting his wallet or coming up with reasons why he couldn't pay. If he did borrow money, it was like throwing it into a black hole. I never saw it again, but I was happy to have someone to hang out with. With that in mind, I decided to put it out of my mind. Our hangouts changed from coffee shops and cinemas to spending time at each other's places. Since Mark still lived with his parents, my place became our usual meeting spot. He loved hanging out at my place, especially Richard's gaming room. Our house had a pool, a man cave, and a gaming room. Mark loved it. He could spend hours in there, lost in games and enjoying the setup. We chat, watch movies, and just have a blast together. It was like having a buddy around. As our friendship grew, Mark and I spent more time together. Our relationship took on a playful, flirtatious vibe. We teased each other, exchanged witty banter, and threw in some playful compliments. It was all in good fun, we said. We promised to never cross any lines or take our banter seriously. I was married and didn't want to cheat on my husband, so at first, we never went beyond flirting. But we kept joking around and teasing each other. Our banter turned into serious flirting, and it felt like we were back in high school, all giddy and excited. Then one day, when Mark was hanging out at my place, things went further than they should have. I had been joking around casually with Mark, and then I sat on his lap as I joked. But then he let me get up. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were making out. Mark, I was really freaked out. It felt good, but I was also terrified. I kicked him out and blocked him, fearing my husband might somehow find out. I felt guilty, but a few hours later, I unblocked Mark. We talked, and it turned out we both wanted more. We decided to keep it quiet, especially since Richard wasn't home much. We could sneak around without anyone knowing. That's where things took a wrong turn with Mark around. I didn't feel alone anymore. It was like he became my go-to. Instead of Richard, whenever he was out of town, Mark would come over and we'd act like a couple doing things that should have been reserved for Richard and me. We would have sex right in the room that I shared with Richard. We would watch movies, cook together, and just hang out. It felt wrong, and I know it was cruel, but the thrill overshadowed any guilt I had. As time went on, I found myself tangled up in this affair with Mark. It was like living a double life, Playing the role of egg roller, I was a happy wife with Richard, but I also had an affair with Mark. Our meetings and hangouts became more frequent and daring. They always happened when Richard was away or busy. I couldn't resist the temptation, even though I felt guilty. Mark and I also grew closer. We shared intimate conversations and revealed parts of ourselves that I never shared with Richard. This created a bond that felt real and comforting. It made me question my feelings and loyalty to my marriage. As time passed, I started to question my commitment to Richard and the life we had built together. Mark was my way out of the boredom and loneliness I felt in my marriage. He made me feel alive and desired in ways I hadn't experienced in a long time. Despite my growing bond with Mark and the excitement he brought into my life, my love for Richard remained strong. I valued the stability, and Richard was a reliable, hard-working guy with a promising future ahead of him. Mark, on the other hand, seemed much more uncertain and risky. Mark's charm and ability to manipulate situations often clouded my judgment. He had a way of making things seem acceptable, even when I knew deep down they were wrong. He convinced me that our affair was harmless and was just a temporary escape from the routine of marriage. I desperately wanted to believe him. I needed reassurance that what I was doing wasn't morally wrong and that I wasn't betraying Richard's trust in the worst way. He told me our affair was harmless and that it was just a temporary escape from the routine of marriage. I really wanted to believe him. I needed reassurance that what I was doing wasn't wrong and that I wasn't betraying Richard's trust. Mark's persuasive words became a lifeline, and they made me doubt myself. He made me feel insecure about my relationship. He told me that we were too clever for Richard to ever suspect anything. He said that our affair was discreet and foolproof. He made me believe that Richard wouldn't even consider the possibility of infidelity. I should have seen through Mark's lies and manipulation. It was foolish of me I was naive enough to believe that we could carry on without Richard ever finding out. By the time he discovered our affair, Mark and I had been together for months. Mark's assurances made me feel secure, which made me lazy and stupid in covering my tracks. Our routine had become so careless. Richard's work trips became. Mark was spending a lot of time at our house, sometimes even staying overnight. I had got used to having him around, to the point where I didn't bother hiding any evidence of our relationship. I let my guard down, thinking that Richard would never suspect a thing. On the day Richard was supposed to leave for a Balith, I was really looking forward to the day trip because I knew I'd get to spend some quality time with Mark. I was playing the role of the supportive wife, helping Richard pack his bags and driving him to the airport. I gave him a big hug and a smile as I said goodbye. I had no idea that this would be the start of the end of my deception. I'd already told Mark about Richard's trip, so I thought Mark would be on his way home by the time I got back. As it turned out, Mark arrived just 30 minutes after I got back. Mark was used to our routine and knew the house well. I told him Richard was away for 2 days, so he brought his overnight bag. We had breakfast together and watched a movie. After we finished eating, we started making out and then went to the bedroom. We were so busy that we didn't notice Richard had come back unexpectedly. He never left for trips. It was all a plan to catch me red-handed. We were still busy having sex when the bedroom door burst open, which shocked us both. I screamed in shock and tried to cover myself, but Richard remained calm and composed. Mark realized the gravity of the situation and that we were busted, so he hastily gathered his clothes and rushed to leave. In his hurry, Richard didn't try to stop him. He just watched Mark leave the house. I was left feeling ashamed and exposed. I was still trying to hide from Richard's gaze. After Mark left in a rush, I heard him scream. It was a wrenching scream, the kind that came directly from your lungs. I quickly covered up and rushed outside to see what was wrong and maybe deal with the mess. Mark's screams were like a punch in the gut. It was chaos. It was a total disaster. Mark's car was on fire, flames dancing, smoke billowing, and Mark a total mess of emotions. Mark didn't park directly in our compound because we didn't want anyone spotting his car in the compound and mentioning it to my husband. Mark usually parked not too far from our house, so I rushed back in to grab our fire extinguisher, hoping it would be enough to put out the fire. The heat was intense, and I was sweating so much that my sweat even began to mix with panic as I battled against the flames. We had wanted to call the fire safety department, but ultimately we put out the flames, and there was no need to call them. Mark was crying at this point, which now that I think about it, was a bit of an eye-opener. It was pretty funny, actually. He even tried to blame me for the whole thing. I had to remind him that I didn't light the fire. My mind was racing. I was trying to make sense of it all. The truth was staring me in the face. This wasn't some random accident. Someone had deliberately set Mark's car on fire, and the timing was just too perfect. Richard's abs looked suspicious too. He stayed inside the house and didn't even come out, even when he heard Mark screaming. I had a feeling Richard was behind it. A car doesn't just catch fire like that. He must have set it on fire before coming into the house. Mark was really upset, saying his car meant a lot to him. He accused Richard of setting it on fire, but he didn't have any proof. I left him to deal with it and went back inside, where Richard was calm and collected, cooking in the kitchen. That's when it hit me that Richard had caught me red. I was caught cheating a few minutes ago. I tried crying and pleading, hoping Richard would forgive me, but he was firm. He gave me 10 minutes to pack up and leave, or face eviction. I quickly gathered my things and carried them out to the porch. I cried relentlessly, but Richard remained unmoved. I banged the door on him. I was desperate, so I tried calling Mark for shelter, but he had already left and abandoned his burnt car. Maybe he was going to get it towed. He didn't answer my calls, and 30 seconds later, he sent me a text. He blamed me entirely and cut ties with me, telling me to never ever I sent him another message. I felt completely lost and had nowhere to turn. My family was hours away, and I wasn't sure if they'd even take me in. Richard took the car keys and wouldn't let me use any of his cars. Mark also shut me out. I reached out to an old friend who reluctantly agreed to. I asked if I could stay for just a week. I had to take an Uber to get to my friend's place because I didn't have any money left. Mark had emptied our joint account, leaving me broke and penniless. I messaged him, asking if I could have something, but he refused, saying it was all his hard-earned money. I had to use my friend's money to pay for the Uber. When I met my friends, I felt like a total wreck. I've been crying nonstop. I'm looking for advice on how to fix the mess I've made of my marriage. I know I made a terrible mistake, and I'm facing the consequences of my actions. I'm torn between guilt, regret, and a desperate desire to you. I'm trying to salvage what's left of my relationship with Richard. I don't want to lose my husband. Any real advice would mean a lot to me right now. Thanks for listening. Update. Things have been intense since my last post. I've been avoiding the comments for a while because they've been brutal. It's been about a week since I first shared my story, and the number of comments hasn't slowed down. They range from supportive to downright nasty, with many of you pointing fingers at me. I want to set the record straight. I'm not painting my husband as the bad guy. I'm just sharing my side of the story honestly. If he hadn't neglected me, maybe things wouldn't have gone down this path. But dwelling on blame won't fix anything. As for updates, not much has changed. I have to leave my friend's place soon, and I'm bouncing between couch surfing and shelters. It's not ideal, but I'm trying to make do. My husband mentioned legal papers. I'm bracing myself for that too. In the meantime, I'm taking up some short-term contracts to save up enough money. My goal is to have a stable place to go after the divorce. I'm going to go back home to my parents. Even if it's post-divorce, going back home would be a relief and would be better than homelessness. Just wanted to give you a quick update. I've been served with divorce papers. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but deep down, I know it's probably for the best. I'll be heading to court soon to finalize everything. I'm ready to sign the papers, because let's face it, I messed up big time. On another note, Mark hasn't reached out. I've realized that I was just a temporary distraction for him. I was a bit of a fool to think otherwise. It hurts, but I can't blame him for that. I blame myself for letting him back into my life despite knowing how toxic our history was. I'm still juggling side gigs for now. I'm not making a lot of money, but it's enough to keep me going. I'll probably share another update after the court proceedings. I don't want to dwell on the legal stuff, and hopefully it'll be over quickly since I've already agreed to sign the papers. The divorce was finalized without much hassle since I had already signed the papers. It's official. We're divorced now. Before we went into the courtroom, I tried to talk to Richard and maybe sway him into thinking I was making a mistake, but he wouldn't even look at me. He expressed his disgust and told me bluntly that he was the one who set the car on fire. In his eyes, it was justified given what I had done. He said I deserved it for being so selfish and ungrateful. It hit me hard. I had a bit of a wobbly in the bathroom, but I managed to pull myself together. I realized how much I'd missed Richard, but it was too late. On the bright side, I'd managed to save enough money to come back home. My parents agreed to let me stay for a while, but they weren't happy about it. They, like everyone else, believe I brought this upon myself. I know I've been through a lot, and I'm aware that I've made mistakes. I'm aware that my own family don't support my decision to get divorced. But I'm trying to move on from that. I'm currently looking for a job, despite having a gap in my CV. I'm optimistic that I'll find something that pays the bills. This will probably be my final update to those who have offered support and kindness. Thank you to the rest. Well, you can figure that out. Thanks for listening, everyone.